Thank you for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. Shit's about to get real. Cash Flow King with you again today. And today, in episode 5, we are going to talk about the power of your mortgage. Before we get into today's episode, real quick reminder, anybody that may have a personal finance question that you would like to have answered on the show, we are planning to do some Q&A shows in the future. And right now, we're compiling a list of personal finance questions. Please feel free to send an email to realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com. Again, that's realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com. Feel free to make up a name, have some fun with it. We are an explicit show, so make your name whatever you want within reason. The better the name, the higher the likelihood that your question will get read on one of the sooner shows as opposed to down the road. With that said, let's go ahead and get into today's episode, number 5, about the power of your mortgage. And I know the title of the show probably sounds a little bit ridiculous, but bear with me and hear me out. And I think your viewpoint, or at least your mind, hopefully will open up a little bit. And here's some things today that you may not have heard before. Maybe you have, but chances are you probably haven't. First of all, the power of your mortgage does not mean go out and buy a McMansion. Of course, unless that's what you want and you have the means to do so, feel free to do that. But that's not really what today's show is about. What I am asking you to do, though, is to just keep an open mind. As I'm recording this show, and part of the reason that I came up with this show was really thinking back in my own personal life about 10 years ago. This is sort of what I did when I became first exposed to some of this information. Keeping an open mind kind of changed my viewpoint pretty significantly over that past decade or so. That's what made me personally go from being excited about paying my 30-year fixed interest rate mortgage off in 25 years. I was going to make biweekly mortgage payments. That basically meant that I was going to make the equivalent of one extra payment per year, and I would have shaved 5 years off of my loan. That's where my mindset was about 10 years ago before I became exposed to some of this information. And then I transitioned over time to sort of my thought process now, which is I will absolutely never pay an extra penny towards principal again. And I know that probably sounds a little bit crazy. It certainly did to me when I first became exposed to some of this stuff. It kind of flipped a lot of things that I had learned on its head and really made me rethink what we've all been taught and conditioned to think in the personal finance space for the longest time. Before we get into the content today, I do know that this is probably going to be a slightly controversial episode, and I want to start off and I'll close out by saying something along the same lines, which is you still need to make the personal decision that's right for you and your family. This is not a one-size-fits-all. This is simply let's look at some things from a slightly different perspective and see if that might change our minds and how we decide to go about things in our own personal financial journey. So with that said, let's continue on here. I'd like to start by just busting an important myth that I've heard before and perhaps you've heard people say before, and that is something to the effect of prepaying your mortgage or paying extra towards the principal on your mortgage somehow increases the market value of your home. That's wrong. Absolutely incorrect. Pretty much irrefutable as far as that goes. That is not the case. Prepaying your mortgage has absolutely no effect on the market value of your home. And in the context of today's show, when we talk about your home, we are talking about your primary residence, where you live. We're not talking about rental property or investment property. And I understand there could be some cases where that could be considered the same thing. That's really not the focus of today's show, although I do love investment real estate. That's not what we're going to be talking about today. This is just on your own personal residence, which generally for most folks, if you own your home, is going to be a single family home. Not always, but that's sort of the focus of today's show. And so prepaying your mortgage, again, has no effect on the market value of your home. The market value of your home is driven by a number of factors, but primarily by market comps or comparable sales. Other properties that are very similar in size and style and square footage and numbers of bedrooms and bathrooms and the size of the garage, if you have one, and those sorts of things in your immediate neighborhood and the surrounding area that have sold relatively recently or very recently. That is going to be the primary driver of the market value of your home. And that's probably not news to most of you, but the reason I bring that up is simply that the debt that you may have on your home simply doesn't matter. And so let's look at a quick example. Let's say you had a $400,000 home that appreciated over a period of time, and for ease of numbers, let's say this happened over a 1-year time period, and you got a 10% appreciation rate on that $400,000 home. That's $40,000. My question to you would be, how does the loan amount, your loan amount, if you have a loan on the home, affect this number? How does your loan amount affect the market-driven appreciation that you received on your home? And the answer is, it doesn't. It just simply doesn't. Okay, whether you had a fairly large loan on the home, say you put 20% down, you took out a loan for 80%, that would be what we call an 80% LTV, which stands for loan to value. So you took out a loan for 80% of the value of the home, whether that was the case or you simply paid cash for the home and you did not have a loan on the home. Either way, you still got $40,000 of market-driven appreciation. So prepaying your mortgage or paying extra on your mortgage has absolutely no impact on the market value of your home. It does, however, increase your equity faster via principal paydown. So if you're paying extra in principal on your home mortgage, you are increasing your equity faster, at least initially. But the real question is that what we really want? Do we really want more equity in our home? What exactly does that mean? I would make an argument that paying extra on your mortgage without completely paying it off, just making that extra principal payment, actually, and this is kind of counterintuitive, but that it actually increases your risk. And why would I say that? Well, the reality is, let's say that you had some sort of a job loss or an income loss, and you continued to pay down your home for many, many years. You still owed some money on it, but you were paying it down aggressively, and you were building up this equity, and you thought this was the right thing to do. And believe me, I was there at one point, right? This is exactly what I used to think. If that happens to you, and you owe a little bit on your home, let's say you owe 10% loan to value. So the loan amount that you have is 10% of the value of the home. So let's say in this example, you got a $400,000 home, you owe 40 grand. The reality is, whether you owe just 40 grand or you owe the entire 400 grand, does that really matter if you can't make the payment? Whether you owe one payment to the bank or you owe 360 payments to the bank, if you can't and you don't make the payment, you can lose your home through foreclosure. So the question again would be, if that happened to you, what safety does that extra equity give you in the event you're not able to make the payment? And the answer is obviously none. It doesn't matter, right? It actually gives the bank an incentive to foreclose on you versus maybe the other person that has less equity in their home, and the bank's essentially on the hook, right? If you had two identical houses, same neighborhood, same bedroom, bathroom, square footage, the whole 9 yards, you had two different individuals living there, and person A basically owes, well, we'll say 10 payments left on their home, and person B just bought that exact same home, and they owe 360 payments on their home. And let's say they got a loan for 80% of the value of that home. And both of those borrowers can't make the next payment. Who are they going to come after and more than likely foreclose on first? The person that has the big-ass loan that just bought the house, or the person that's been aggressively paying down towards principal and building up equity in their home that has it almost, but not all the way, paid off? Which one of those two individuals are they going to foreclose on? Which one is more profitable for the bank? And the answer is the person that owes the least. They can go ahead and take that property back, and the bank would stand to make probably a fairly large profit on turning around and selling that home. Not that they're in the business of wanting to own real estate. They're not. But if they had to choose a borrower to foreclose on, it's going to be the one with gobs and gobs of equity because it's a more profitable decision for them as the bank. So just something to think about there that not a lot of people talk about. Having that extra equity in the home really, really isn't as safe as you might think that it is. The other thing when we talk about equity in a home is that it can be taken away by the real estate market at any time. And generally speaking, real estate markets will move a lot more slowly than stock markets. We're recording this at the end of January 2022, and we're experiencing some volatility in the stock market right now. things tend to move pretty quickly when we're talking about the stock market, but not as much in the real estate market. They tend to move a little bit more slowly. But with that said, if we have a housing crash of some kind at some point in the future, the first thing that's going to go is the equity. So if you have gobs and gobs of equity in your home and the real estate market crashes and you turn around and decide you want to sell your home, you could be very surprised that you don't have what you thought you did, and that equity is essentially gone. The market can take that away from you. However, on the flip side, if we continue to experience a strong real estate market and we continue to have price appreciation in terms of home prices, regardless of whether or not you have debt on the home and how much debt you have on the home, like we've already talked about, you will continue to benefit from that equity increase due to market-driven appreciation. And so again, it goes back to the fact that having debt on the home or not having debt on the home is not going to limit your upside, but it absolutely can affect the downside. When you have gobs and gobs of equity, that's going to be the first thing to go in the event of a crash if real estate prices were to plummet. So those are a couple of very important points. The next thing I want to talk about is having a home that is completely paid off versus effectively paid off. And this is kind of a weird but somewhat interesting concept. So which one of those two is better? If you have a home that you no longer owe anything on, you have no mortgage, or if you had a situation where you have enough assets that are liquid that if you desired to, for whatever crazy reason, I don't see why personally that you would do this, but you could pay it off. Which one of those two is the better spot to be in, right? So if we look at an extreme example, what if you had no mortgage, but no income? So you're debt-free. Congratulations. Yay! Everybody wants to celebrate debt-free, right? But in reality, it's a bunch of bullshit, because if you don't have income or assets, then debt-free in solitude, that's essentially useless. Now what can you do? You might not owe anything on your home in the form of a mortgage, but can you buy groceries? Debt-free in solitude really isn't doing you any favors. But on the other hand, on the other side of that spectrum, what if you did have a mortgage on the property, but you had plenty of assets and income to service the debt on that mortgage? I would make an argument that's actually a safer position to be in, especially when we're talking about long-term fixed interest rate mortgages. With today's low interest rate environments, that's probably something that you're going to want to be looking at, as opposed to some of the ARMs, the adjustable rate mortgages that may have been more popular at one time. Based on where rates are right now, fixed rate is generally going to be the place that you're wanting to look. You could still have a mortgage, but have the assets and income to effectively pay off or kill that mortgage if you wanted to, and I would argue that that's safer. And even if you didn't have enough to completely pay off the mortgage, as long as you have a surplus such that you can continue to make the payment, you can still control 100% of the property just by being able to make that monthly payment. And we don't want to get caught up in the sake of making monthly payments and buying things on payments. That's not what we're talking about here, but we are talking about just being able to control the real estate. Next would be inflation profiting. So if we look at the principal and interest component of the mortgage payment, which is generally going to be the largest portion of that payment, if you have a fixed interest rate mortgage, that principal and interest component is not going to change for the life of that loan. So what does that mean? It means that the loan actually becomes easier and easier to pay over time, because inflation essentially erodes the value of the debt. Think about it. Would you take $1 million in today's environment and put it in the bank at essentially zero and leave it there for a long period of time? Probably not. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, because inflation is simply going to eat that money alive, and your purchasing power down the line, what you can actually buy for that same $1 million, is going to be significantly less due to inflation. So if we wouldn't leave cash in the bank for an extended period of time, how do we kind of flip that on its head when we're talking about mortgages? Well, depending on your mortgage, if you have a long-term fixed interest rate mortgage, like we're talking about here, and that becomes easier and easier to pay over time, that would actually, in my opinion, be considered an asset to you, quote unquote, even though it's technically a liability on your balance sheet. In reality, in my opinion, it's more of an asset, because it becomes easier and easier to pay over time, and inflation is just eroding that away, especially in today's environment. Here we are in January of 2022, when you can lock up long-term fixed interest rate debt at less than half of the rate of recent inflation, which has been somewhere in the neighborhood of 7% plus or minus a little bit, depending on the source that you listen to. So that's another thing to keep in mind as far as the inflation profiting benefit of having a mortgage. Just like you wouldn't keep cash in the bank, why would you pay that mortgage off early when you could just have it essentially sit there and effectively work for you? And we'll talk about some examples here coming up where you're benefiting from the inflation erosion of the value of that debt. Next, I call this an asset protection bonus. This is not an asset protection strategy. And once again, just as a reminder, we don't give tax or legal advice. We don't even give financial advice on this show. We don't give any advice on this show. We do this for entertainment purposes only, education and entertainment. But with that said, and we'll probably cover something called equity stripping on another podcast when we'll talk about collateralizing assets. It's a little bit beyond the scope of today. But if you have a mortgage on your property and you don't have gobs and gobs of equity that are essentially exposed, then you can intentionally keep the bullseye off your back in the event that somebody else were to take legal action against you for some other crazy reason. If there aren't gobs and gobs of equity there to go after, then that's kind of an asset protection bonus. Yeah, you can have other entity structures and you can have an umbrella policy and do all that, and that's great. I mean, you should actually have a legitimate asset protection strategy. That's why I kind of put this here in quotes and called it an asset protection bonus, but it's kind of a nice kicker to not have yourself overly exposed to any potential legal action that may be taken against you, because if there's not a ton of equity to go after, then that's one less thing that somebody can come after you for in the event that you were ever sued. Next thing to think about would be, what about a property insurance claim, hazard insurance? Let's say that something happens to your home that's catastrophic. Maybe there's some sort of storm or major peril that happens, and you get into a situation where you don't agree with what the insurance adjuster says about your home and whether or not that claim is covered or how much that insurance company is going to have to pay out on that claim. Do you want to have to personally go ahead and reach out to and hire your own counsel to deal with that insurance company because let's say you paid off your home and you no longer have a mortgage on the property? Do you want to incur that expense? Or would you rather have the bank with the majority of skin in the game and them being on the hook because your house is their collateral, right? That's what's collateralizing that mortgage loan. Would you rather have the legal team of the bank go after the insurance company and deal with them and try to come to a resolution because it's in their best interest to make sure that your home is restored to where it needs to be and that they're not shortchanging you on that claim or even denying that claim, saying that it wasn't covered for some reason, assuming that it was legitimately covered? So that's something else to be thinking about. Next would be lifestyle design. We're going to talk in a little while some examples about investing the difference between 15 versus a 30-year mortgage. But let's just say that investments aside and investing the difference aside, you don't even necessarily have to do that. What about just simply enjoying your life now? Not necessarily feeling like you have to pay cash for a home, or you have to pay extra towards your principal on a home, or even that you have to take out a shorter home loan than you otherwise would, when maybe you want to take an extra vacation. Maybe you want to take some trips with your family. You can't get the time back. None of us can, right? People say, well, time is money. Yeah, I guess you could make that argument, but I would say that time's probably more valuable than money because we don't get any more time. Time we have here, however much time we have left, that's it. But money, finances, on the other hand, that's a renewable resource. We can earn more. We can make more. We can create more, right? So that's something else to keep in mind. You see so many people that take their prime years when maybe they are raising a family and they are, they do have children and they want to go different places and do different things, but yet they're in a race to, and it's just crazy to me that people actually do this, but they're in a race to go to work and make a bunch of money and work a bunch of hours, and then they're going to take this money and then they're going to plow it and bury it under their house when inflation is through the roof and they have this fixed interest rate mortgage, but they're rushing to pay it down because all they can think about is how great it's going to feel when the home is paid off. And for any individual, that, quite frankly, it might be the right decision, but is that individual thinking about all the things that we're talking about on today's show and all the different considerations when it comes to the power, as I like to call it, of your mortgage? And I would make an argument that chances are that person may not be thinking about those things. So why not go ahead and take the trips and spend the money and live your life and do what you want to do now? Part of lifestyle design. We're all always going to have a quote-unquote housing payment of some kind. So if you don't own a home, you're probably not listening to this episode anyway, but if you don't, and you're renting, you're presumably going to have to pay rent forever, right? Somewhere, unless you're living at home for free or something like that. Chances are you are going to continue to have a rent payment as part of your housing payment. And even once your mortgage is paid off, you're still going to have to pay property taxes. If you don't believe me, don't pay your property taxes and see how long you keep the property. Probably not a good idea, not advice. And also, property insurance. Now, when you have a mortgage, generally that will be required by the lender. But let's say that your home is paid off. You could choose not to have hazard insurance on your property. I wouldn't recommend that because fairly small amount of money to pay in premium for pretty robust coverage most of the time, where that is more than likely something that you're going to want to continue to have. So no matter what, we're still going to have a housing payment, even if part of that housing payment is no longer a mortgage in the form of principal and interest. So we're still going to have to pay something. And I think a lot of people think that once their mortgage is completely paid off, they're going to pay $0 in perpetuity, which isn't going to be the case. You're still going to have your upkeep. If you have an HOA fee, you're still going to have that. You're still going to have property taxes. You're still going to have more than likely property insurance. There's going to be a whole host of things that are still going to be there. The principal and interest component due to the mortgage is only one component of that housing payment. As I mentioned a few moments ago, technically your mortgage is the bank's asset, and it's our, as consumers and of personal finance, it's our liability. But I would make the argument, as I said before, that prudent use of mortgages and intentionally either keeping your loan to value ratios fairly high or, essentially the loan's going to amortize no matter what. So eventually you will pay it off if you don't harvest equity, which we'll cover on another show. But I wouldn't be in any sort of big rush to go ahead and pay that loan down more quickly than you need to. By keeping those LTVs relatively high in a responsible way, I'm not saying go out and buy a McMansion that you can't afford and put 3.5% down and live on cat food and be broke. That's not what the show is about. But it is about strategically working your balance sheet, and that's a little bit about what we're talking about here today. I would make the argument that you could actually consider your mortgage a form of your own asset, even though technically it's a liability. Hence, the power of your mortgage and what it allows you to do. All the things that we talked about already, right? Inflation profiting, an asset protection bonus, dealing with insurance claims, having the flexibility for lifestyle design. All those different things are benefits that your mortgage essentially provides you. And then the last thing that we'll cover here is the age-old debate about a 15-year versus a 30-year mortgage. And we're going to run through some numbers. Here we go. If we looked at the median home price, and this is according to the National Association of Realtors as of June 2021 in the United States, the median home price at that time was reportedly $362,800. We're going to assume, and there's different ways, this isn't a show about how to buy your first home. I'm not a loan officer. There's different programs out there with different down payment requirements and income and credit requirements. We're not getting into any of that today. We're just going to make the assumption that somebody's getting a vanilla blanket conventional loan with 20% down, which means on a $362,800 median home price, the loan amount that they're taking out is $290,240. Okay? Based on interest rates, and again, these will vary. Did you pay points? Did you not pay points? What's your credit score? What type of loan product are you using? These rates are going to vary. But if you look at the average 15-year rate right now on a fixed interest rate mortgage, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2.99%. So your monthly payment, and we're talking principal and interest only to keep this kind of an apples to apples. Yes, you will have a property tax and property insurance component to this. You may also have an HOA component to this. If you put less than 20% down, you may have a PMI component to this, or if you're using an FHA loan, an MIP component. There's so many different components that can go into the monthly payment. We are only right now talking about the principal and interest component. So if you take a $290,240 loan at 2.99% on a 15-year mortgage, your payment would be in the neighborhood of $2,069. And the interest that you would pay over the life of that loan is about $70,000. If you take the same loan amount, but now we go out to a 30-year fixed interest rate mortgage, and we have an average interest rate of about 3.76%, that monthly payment amount for principal and interest only is about $1,412 per month. And the interest that you would pay over the life of the loan would be $194,000. Now, most people would simply tell you, well, hey, I'm going to go ahead, if I can afford the payment, and get the 15-year loan. I get a lower interest rate. Look at how much less interest I pay over the life of the loan. My home is paid off that much sooner. Then my cash flow is going to increase, and now I can take that increased cash flow and I can invest it, and life is going to be just great. And for some people, that actually might work, but we're going to run through some numbers here where I could actually make the argument for many different reasons that you might consider getting the 30-year loan. Because that's only what we've talked about up until this point as far as these numbers. That's only kind of part one of the total equation or the total picture. What most people fail to recognize and go further into is, what about that second part of that total equation and how your mortgage might be able to allow you to build wealth a little bit faster? And so to do that, we're going to take a look now at what I like to call part two and get into some different time periods. So we're going to take two different time periods. We're going to take the first 15 years, and then we're going to take the next 15 years, and we're going to have person A and person B, okay? And the question is, what do you end up with at the end? So in addition to all the other benefits that we discussed along the way up until this point, we talked about inflation profiting, asset protection bonus, insurance claim, lifestyle design, the whole idea that prepaying your mortgage actually doesn't really do anything for you, right? You think you're increasing your equity, but if the market turns against you, it's the first thing to go. And if the market goes to the upside, you're going to get that no matter how much debt you have. All those things, keep all that in mind as we go through this example. This is just going to be the numerical part of it. So in the first 15 years, person A gets a 15-year mortgage, and they're making that payment in this example of $2,069 a month. So they don't have any additional dollars for any extra investing. I'm not saying this person's not investing and that they're not putting money into their retirement plan at work if they have one, and that they're not putting money into a Roth IRA. Whatever these people do outside of this, that will all stay the same. We're just looking at any additional dollars available for investment in the context of these monthly payment amounts. So person A gets the 15-year mortgage. They're not investing anything extra. So we have $0 of extra investing, okay? Person B, same property, same loan, same everything, same credit score and whatnot. They get a 30-year mortgage where that payment, instead of the $2,069, is now $1,412. So the difference between those two monthly payments is $657 a month. So let's say that person B decides to go ahead and start investing that $657 a month. At the end of 15 years, what does that look like? We have to make some assumptions here, right? So it probably goes without saying, depending on what you're investing in, the higher the rate of return you can get on that investment, the larger the difference you're going to see in some of these numbers as we continue throughout this example. So for all my real estate people out there, it's probably not uncommon to be getting total rates of return in the teens, even in the 20s, and possibly even more than that. For all my stock market people out there, depending on your portfolio and your risk tolerance and your allocations, you're probably going to be somewhere in the single digits. So for the purposes of keeping this accessible to pretty much everybody and keeping the numbers relatively simple, I went ahead and calculated this initially with a 7% average annual rate of return. We're just going to use a stock market-based type of return with a fairly aggressive portfolio over a long period of time. And notice, we're doing this over a 15 to 30-year horizon. We're not talking about investing for 1 year, for 2 years, for 6 months. You might say, oh, well, why would I invest the difference? The market's down 3-4% today, blah, blah, blah. Well, we're not talking about today, all right? We're talking about a longer time period where there's certainly no guarantees, but there's an overwhelming likelihood that we're going to achieve some positive investment returns and results over a long period of time. That's kind of what we're going for here. So at the end of that first 15-year time period, what happens? Person A has a paid-off home, and they have $0 in extra investments because, remember, they were making that higher monthly mortgage payment for that first 15 years. They were not investing anything extra. They just have the paid-off home, all right? So now there's no mortgage. Person B has a partially paid-off home because they're about halfway into the amortization schedule on that 30-year fixed interest rate mortgage. But remember, they were investing $657 a month extra that they were saving by not having to make that higher payment. So at a 7% average annual rate of return over that 15-year time period, that person B would have the partially paid off home and $209,000 in extra investments. Again, this is in addition to whatever they might be doing for their quote-unquote normal retirement plans. If that person, by the way, got a little bit higher rate of return, let's say they got a 10% average annual rate of return, maybe they're doing some sort of real estate strategy, they would have about $274,000 at the end of this initial 15-year time period. So now let's go to the next 15 years. So for the next 15-year time period, person A that took out that 15-year mortgage initially, their home, remember, is paid off. So for the next 15 years, they're going to invest the entire amount that they were previously paying on that mortgage. They're going to invest that $2,069 per month that they were paying on the mortgage. Person B, remember, they're only halfway through their 30-year loan that they took out, so they're going to have to continue to make that monthly payment of $1,412, but they're also going to continue to invest that additional $657 a month. So they do that for the next 15 years, and then we kind of circle back and say, where are we at the end of that second 15-year time period? So now we're a total of 30 years into the future. What happens? Well, the simple answer is no one fucking knows, because who knows what's going to happen in 30 years. But if you go off these assumptions and continue and finish out this example with me, here's where we are. Person A still has a paid off home. They've had a paid off home now, remember, for 15 years because they got the 15-year mortgage and they paid it off in 15 years. They invested that $2,069 for the last 15 years. So now they have, at a 7% average annual rate of return, extra investments worth about $659,000. That's at a 7% average annual rate of return. If it was a little bit higher, say they got 10%, for example, they'd have about $864,000 of extra investments at the end of that 30-year period. Person B, remember, that's the person that took out the 30-year mortgage initially and just invested the difference for the entire time period. Well, their home is now also paid off, which, by the way, they may or may not choose to keep it that way. We'll cover that on the collateralizing assets episode on how to do some creative things if you should choose to, depending on your risk tolerance. But anyway, for now, they have a paid off home, but they also have not $659,000, but $804,000 of extra investments at a 7% average annual rate of return. Now, the difference between those numbers at 7% is only $145,000, and I know a lot of you are going to be quick to say, well, it's really not worth it, right? $145,000, and that's probably before taxes, and depending on your tax situation after you pay taxes, maybe we're talking about they may only have a difference of $100,000 between the two strategies, and why would I want to invest dollars and take investment risk to have just an extra $100,000 at the end of the rainbow? And if that was the only factor here, if we were only talking about achieving certain investment returns based on these numbers alone, yeah, it may or may not be worth it. But if you factor in some of the other benefits that we talked about throughout the beginning of the episode and you combine those, that's a personal decision ultimately that you would need to make on whether or not that makes sense for you, right? But let's say, again, that we're talking about a 10% average annual rate of return. Well, remember, at the end of 30 years, person A had $864,000. Person B would have almost $1.5 million, $1.49 million at a 10% average annual rate of return. The difference between person A and person B at a 10% average annual rate of return is actually about $630,000. Now, like I said before, it depends on what you're investing in. The higher the average annual rate of return you can achieve in your investments, the more taking the 30-year mortgage and investing the difference is going to bode well in your favor. If you're a very conservative investor, if you're not really getting, decent rates of return over long periods of time, well, then this may not exactly work for you. So again, you have to evaluate your own situation and determine if that's right for you. But remember, in addition to the differences between these financial numbers, you still maintain the benefits of what I like to call the power of your mortgage for a longer period of time. The person that took the 15-year mortgage at the end of 15 years, boom, they lost all those benefits. The person that had the 30-year mortgage that was part of the way through, they still maintained those benefits throughout the duration of that 30-year period. So in my opinion, the real power of your mortgage is in a combination of these things. It's the initial factors we talked about, but also by investing the difference and generating what we like to call positive financial arbitrage, you can really have some fairly significant wealth at the end of it in addition to what you might have already had. So I don't think that a difference of $630,000 is anything to sneeze at, and that's only at a 10%. Again, there's people that are getting 15, 18, 20, 25% in certain types of real estate investments. I didn't run those numbers because I don't want to put that out there into the universe and people say, well, that's just bullshit. Like there's no way that I'm going to get that in my little S&P 500 type of investments, or that I'm going to get that in my stock market based investment portfolio. So we try to keep the numbers a little bit on the more reasonable side that would apply to the masses. All right. So that's pretty much the end of that example on the 15 versus 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Again, remember that the market can take the equity you build away at any time. But if real estate markets and prices go up, you will benefit regardless of whether or not, or regardless of how much debt you have on the property. So what it comes down to, as I've said a couple different times now, this is ultimately a personal decision. You have to do what works for you, but you have to also be aware of the trade-offs. So for anybody that is just getting started, either just getting ready to purchase a home or recently purchased a home, I would strongly consider the 30-year fixed interest rate mortgage for all the reasons that we talked about today, because I think that gives you the most amount of flexibility. I don't think I said this yet, probably goes without saying, but just in case, you could always take out a 30-year mortgage and pay it off in 15 years. Yes, you will have a slightly higher interest rate. Yes, you will still pay a little bit more interest over the life of that loan, but it is an option. So you could always take the 30 and pay it as a 15 if you wanted to, and again, give yourself maximum flexibility. If you take the 15, you got to make the payment. Even if you lose a job, even if you have some unexpected expenses, whatever the case might be, you're really kind of pigeonholing yourself into forcing yourself to make that higher payment amount. And the difference between paying a 30-year mortgage off in 15 years or taking out the 15-year mortgage and paying it in 15 years as far as additional interest paid is negligible. And I would argue that even if you want to have a property paid off sooner, personally, again, I wouldn't. But if that's like you're dead set on that, I still think that's going to give you the most amount of flexibility, because who knows what's going to happen over a 15 or a 30-year time period. A lot of life will happen within that time period, right? There's going to be some good shit that happens and some bad shit that happens and some just unknown that you could never have predicted. So I think that giving yourself the most options while maintaining the benefits of the power of your mortgage, and the kicker that you can have hundreds of thousands, if not well in excess of that, of additional wealth by investing the difference, I think you can make a pretty strong case for the 30-year fixed interest rate mortgage. But nonetheless, whatever mortgage you decide to have, don't get depressed about it. Don't be down in the dumps about it. As long as you didn't buy too much house and do the McMansion thing, you should be excited about the power of your mortgage once you consider all the things that we talked about here today. So with that said, thanks again for joining me, the Cash Flow King, at Real Talk Personal Finance for episode number 5, The Power of Your Mortgage. Quick reminder again, if you haven't already done so and you'd like to, feel free to send a personal finance related question to realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com. Again, that's realtalkpersonalfinance@gmail.com with any personal finance related question that you would like to have answered on an upcoming Q&A show. We're really excited to get that started. And remember, the more creative your fake name is, the higher the likelihood your question is going to get read before somebody else's who just writes in and says, like, anonymous. Like, you make something up that's cool, right? Okay, thanks again for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. We will see you in the next episode.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.